everybody's here because you know that Trump must go now. But now we have to become organizers, every single one of us. And these 4 principles hold this together and can invite new people into this movement so that we can grow.
Were president and his sons for the exaggeration of the values of their real estate holdings in order to receive benefits for loans and insurance purposes, according to New York's Attorney General. I want to bring in John Santucci, has covered the Trump family for years. And John, first look here at the damages here. When it comes to Donald Trump, we know Letitia James had asked for $370 million in damages. What did the judge rule?
So far, David, our team's quickly done some math. It appears the former president is on the hook for $354 million, obviously below what Letitia James was seeking after these months of proceedings that happened in downtown Manhattan, but nevertheless, a significant amount of money.
All right, so something absolutely unprecedented just happened on Capitol Hill, and I need you to understand how massive this is. The United States Senate, the upper chamber of Congress, the body that's supposed to be deliberative and careful and slow-moving, just exploded in a way we haven't seen in modern American history. Senate leaders, including major figures from both parties, are publicly demanding that Donald Trump resign from office, not impeachment, not investigations, resignation. They want him to voluntarily step down and leave the presidency, right now, immediately. And they're not being quiet about it. We're talking about heated floor debates, passionate speeches, urgent press conferences, and a level of political chaos that has Capitol Hill absolutely on fire. This is happening in November 2025, and it's one of those moments where you can feel the entire political landscape shifting in real time. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
All right, so my name is Sansara Taylor. I'm one of the co-initiators of RefuseFascism.org, and I am so pleased to be with you here today in front of this White House occupied by a fascist tyrant.
So what triggered this? Why now? And who exactly is calling for Trump's resignation? Well, it's a perfect storm of scandals, legal defeats, and government dysfunction all crashing together at once. During chaotic Senate sessions that happened between November 10th and 13th, 2025, Democratic leaders joined by several moderate Republicans issued urgent calls for Trump to step down. The reasons they're citing are extensive: historic loss of public trust, failed handling of a major government shutdown crisis, ongoing investigations that keep exposing unlawful conduct and obstruction, legal defeats piling up in courts across the country, executive orders getting blocked left and right, and a general sense that Trump's presidency has become so dysfunctional and scandal-ridden that the only way to restore stability to the government is for him to leave office voluntarily, rather than dragging the country through more impeachment battles and constitutional crises. Senator Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, gave a speech on the Senate floor that was absolutely scathing. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this is close to his actual words, "The American people deserve stability. The government cannot function like this. The president must step down for the sake of the country." And here's what's really wild. He wasn't alone. Senator Lisa Murkowski, a moderate Republican from Alaska who's been critical of Trump before, echoed those sentiments. She said essentially the same thing, that Trump's continued presence in office is preventing the government from functioning, and that resignation is the best path forward for everyone. When you've got senators from both parties standing up and publicly calling for the president to resign, that's not normal political opposition. That's a full-scale revolt by the Senate against the presidency, and it's absolutely unprecedented in modern times. The immediate trigger for all of this was a government shutdown crisis that reached its absolute peak in early November 2025. The federal government was running out of funding. Negotiations over a spending bill had completely broken down, and lawmakers from both parties were blaming Trump for the chaos. They were saying Trump's demands were unrealistic, his negotiating tactics were destructive, and his refusal to compromise was pushing the entire government toward a cliff. The shutdown was affecting federal workers, disrupting services, and creating real hardship for Americans across the country. and senators were getting flooded with angry calls and emails from constituents demanding that Congress fix the problem. But they couldn't fix it because Trump wouldn't agree to any deal that didn't include everything he wanted. So the Senate finally said enough is enough. Multiple senators stood up and said, look, we can't govern with this president. He needs to resign so we can move forward and actually do our jobs. But the government shutdown wasn't the only issue driving calls for resignation. There's also the mountain of ongoing scandals and legal problems that Trump is facing, court cases where judges have ruled against him, appeals that have failed, executive orders that have been blocked as unconstitutional, investigations that keep uncovering new evidence of misconduct. And all of this is happening while Trump is supposed to be governing the country. Senators are arguing that Trump is spending so much time and energy dealing with his legal problems that he can't effectively do the job of being president. And they're saying, that's not fair to the American people who deserve a president who's focused on their needs rather than on staying out of jail. So the resignation demands aren't just about one scandal or one crisis. They're about a pattern of dysfunction and legal jeopardy that senators believe makes Trump incapable of continuing in office. And here's what makes this moment so dramatic and so potentially dangerous for Trump. When the Senate turns against you, you're in real trouble. The Senate is where impeachment trials happen. The Senate has to confirm your appointees. The Senate has enormous power over the presidency. And if Senate leaders from both parties are publicly saying you need to resign, that creates massive political pressure. It signals to the country and to the world that Trump has lost the confidence of his own government. It emboldens his critics and demoralizes his supporters. And it makes it much harder for Trump to govern effectively, even if he refuses to resign. So whether Trump actually steps down or not, and spoiler alert, he's probably not going to, the fact that Senate leaders are demanding it is a huge deal that fundamentally changes the political dynamics of his presidency. Capitol Hill is on fire. The Senate is in revolt. And Trump is facing the biggest challenge to his presidency yet. Let's break it all down. Okay, so let's dig into what actually happened during those chaotic November Senate sessions, because the details are absolutely wild. Starting on November 10th, 2025, the Senate convened for what was supposed to be routine business dealing with the government funding crisis. The federal government's funding was set to expire, and without a new spending bill, we were headed for a shutdown. Democrats and Republicans had been negotiating for weeks, trying to come up with a compromise that could pass both chambers and get signed by the president. But those negotiations kept falling apart. And the reason they kept falling apart, according to senators from both parties, was Donald Trump. They were saying Trump kept moving the goalposts, making new demands at the last minute, threatening to veto any deal that didn't include his priorities, and generally making it impossible to reach a bipartisan agreement. So the Senate met on November 10th to try one more time to hammer out a deal, and that's when things exploded. During floor debate, multiple senators stood up and gave speeches that went way beyond just criticizing Trump's negotiating tactics. They started questioning whether Trump was capable of governing at all. They brought up the mounting scandals, the legal defeats, the investigations, all of it, and they started saying out loud what many had apparently been saying privately for a while, that Trump needs to resign. Senator Schumer, as the Democratic leader, was one of the most vocal. He gave a lengthy speech laying out all the reasons why Trump's presidency had become untenable. The government shutdown crisis, the ongoing investigations into Trump's conduct, the court rulings against Trump's policies, the erosion of public trust. And Schumer concluded by saying that the only way to restore stability and allow the government to function was for Trump to step down voluntarily. But what made this moment truly unprecedented was that Schumer wasn't alone. Several other senators, including some Republicans, either gave similar speeches or issued statements agreeing with the call for resignation. Lisa Murkowski stood up and said that Trump had lost the confidence of the Senate and that continuing in office was damaging the country. Other moderate Republicans, while not explicitly calling for resignation, gave speeches that strongly implied Trump should consider stepping down for the good of the nation. One senator said something like, "When a president can no longer effectively govern, when every initiative is met with scandal and controversy, when the basic functions of government are grinding to a halt, that president needs to ask themselves whether they're serving the country or their own ego." That's not quite calling for resignation, but it's pretty close. And the fact that these statements were coming from Republicans, even moderate ones, sent shockwaves through Washington. The government shutdown issue was really the catalyst for all of this. Federal funding was set to expire on November 11th or 12th, depending on which deadline you were looking at. And as that deadline approached, negotiations became more and more desperate. Senators from both parties were trying to put together a stopgap funding bill. something that would keep the government running for a few more weeks while they worked out a longer-term deal. But Trump was threatening to veto anything that didn't include major policy concessions on things like border security, immigration enforcement, and other priorities. Democrats were saying those demands were unreasonable and that a stopgap bill should just be about keeping the government funded, not about policy battles. And Republicans were caught in the middle, trying to figure out how to avoid a shutdown while also not completely alienating the president. The whole thing came to a head on November 11th when the Senate actually passed a bill to avoid the shutdown. They managed to cobble together enough votes from both parties to pass a relatively clean funding bill. But even as they were doing that, senators were openly questioning whether Trump would sign it, and that's when more of the resignation talk started. Multiple senators essentially said, look, we're doing our jobs, we're finding compromises, we're keeping the government running, but the president is undermining all of it with unreasonable demands and threats. How are we supposed to govern like this? And that's when the calls for Trump to resign became not just about his scandals and legal problems, but about his basic ability to work with Congress and fulfill the constitutional duties of the presidency. Beyond the immediate shutdown crisis, senators were also pointing to Trump's mounting legal problems as evidence that he couldn't effectively govern. In the weeks leading up to these Senate sessions, Trump had suffered a string of legal defeats. Court cases where judges ruled against him, appeals that failed, executive orders that were blocked as unconstitutional or illegal, and ongoing investigations that kept producing new evidence of misconduct. Senators were arguing that Trump was spending more time dealing with lawyers and fighting legal battles than he was spending on actual governance. They were pointing to appointments that weren't being filled, policies that weren't being implemented, foreign policy crises that weren't being addressed, all because Trump was too distracted by his legal problems to focus on the job of being president, and they were saying that's not sustainable. You can't have a president who's more worried about staying out of jail than about running the country. There was also a lot of talk in these Senate sessions about Trump's eroding support. Even among his own party, multiple senators referenced private conversations where Republican colleagues had expressed frustration, disappointment, or outright anger with Trump's conduct. They talked about how Trump's behavior was making it harder for Republicans to win elections, harder to pass legislation, harder to govern effectively, and they suggested that Trump was becoming a liability even to his own party, let alone to the country as a whole. One senator said something like, I've talked to colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and everyone is exhausted. Everyone is tired of the chaos, tired of the scandals, tired of waking up every morning, wondering what new crisis we're going to have to deal with. That's no way to run a country. And the only way to end this exhaustion, according to these senators, was for Trump to recognize that he'd lost the confidence of the government and the people and voluntarily step down. The floor speeches during these sessions were remarkably passionate and emotional. You could tell that senators weren't just going through the motions or making political points. They seemed genuinely frustrated, genuinely concerned about the state of the government, and genuinely convinced that Trump's resignation was necessary. One senator gave a speech about how federal workers were calling their office in tears, worried about how they were going to pay their bills if the government shut down. Another talked about military families who were facing uncertainty because of the chaos in Washington. Another talked about how our international allies were questioning America's stability and reliability because of the constant dysfunction, and they all tied it back to Trump, arguing that his presidency had become so toxic and so dysfunctional that it was actively harming the country. Trump's response to all of this was, predictably, defiant. He posted on Truth Social calling the Senate leaders weak, calling the resignation demands a coup attempt, and insisting he would never resign because he'd done nothing wrong. He claimed the government shutdown crisis was Congress's fault for not supporting his policies. He said the legal cases against him were all political witch hunts that proved the establishment was out to get him, and he vowed to fight on regardless of what Senate leaders said. That's classic Trump, doubling down when under pressure, attacking his critics rather than addressing their concerns, and refusing to give an inch, even when the political pressure is enormous. But the question is whether that strategy will work this time, when the pressure is coming, not just from his usual critics, but from Senate leaders, including members of his own party. The media coverage of all this has been absolutely wall-to-wall. Every major news network has been running near constant coverage of the Senate sessions, the resignation demands, and Trump's response. Political analysts are debating whether Trump will actually resign, what would happen if he did, and how this affects everything from the 2026 midterm elections to America's standing in the world. Some commentators are saying this is the beginning of the end for Trump's presidency. that the Senate revolt signals his support has finally collapsed beyond recovery. Others are saying Trump will never resign no matter how much pressure he faces, that this is just more political theater that won't actually change anything. But everyone agrees that the spectacle of Senate leaders from both parties publicly calling for the president to resign is unprecedented in modern times and represents a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between the executive and legislative branches. There's also been a lot of discussion about what would happen if Trump actually did resign. Vice president would become president. The government would have to transition to new leadership in the middle of a term. There would be questions about policy continuity, about appointments, about ongoing initiatives, and there would be enormous political fallout with Trump's base probably viewing resignation as a betrayal, and Democrats probably viewing it as long overdue accountability. It would be chaotic and unprecedented, but some senators are arguing it would still be better than the current situation where the presidency is essentially non-functional because Trump is too mired in scandal and legal problems to govern effectively. All right, let's break down what all of this actually means and where things go from here, because the implications are massive. Point one, the Senate's public demand for Trump's resignation is a huge deal. Constitutionally and politically, even if Trump never actually resigns, the Senate is one of the most powerful institutions in the American government. It has the authority to try impeachments, confirm appointments, ratify treaties, and shape legislation. When Senate leaders from both parties stand up and say the president needs to resign, that's a vote of no confidence in the most serious way possible. It signals that Trump has lost the ability to work with the legislative branch. It suggests that his presidency has become so dysfunctional that even members of his own party don't want him in office anymore. And it creates a permission structure for other Republicans to criticize or abandon Trump without being seen as disloyal or traitorous to the party. Throughout Trump's presidency, one of his greatest strengths has been the unwavering support of Republican elected officials. Even when they privately disagreed with him or disapproved of his conduct, most Republicans publicly defended him or at least refused to criticize him. That created a united front that made Trump politically strong despite scandals and controversies. But when Senate leaders, including Republicans, start publicly calling for resignation, that united front cracks. It shows that some Republicans have decided Trump is more of a liability than an asset. And once that process starts, it can accelerate quickly. More Republicans might feel emboldened to speak out. More might decide to distance themselves from Trump to protect their own political futures. And eventually, Trump could find himself politically isolated with support only from his most hardcore base. That would make it almost impossible for him to govern effectively even if he stays in office. Point two, the government shutdown crisis that triggered these resignation demands highlights a fundamental problem with Trump's approach to governance. Trump tends to view negotiations as zero-sum games where he needs to win everything and the other side needs to lose. That works okay in business, or at least it's how Trump did business, but it doesn't work in government. In government, you need to build coalitions, make compromises, and work with people who disagree with you. The legislative process requires give and take. You can't just demand everything you want and threaten to blow up the whole system if you don't get it. But that's essentially what Trump was doing with the funding negotiations. He was making demands that he knew Democrats couldn't accept, threatening to veto anything that didn't meet all his requirements, and leaving Congress in an impossible position where they couldn't pass anything that both satisfied Trump and could get bipartisan support. And here's the thing, senators from both parties are exhausted by this dynamic. They're tired of trying to do their jobs only to have Trump blow up deals at the last minute or make new demands that restart the whole process. They're tired of explaining to constituents why the government is shutting down or why basic functions aren't being performed. They're tired of the constant chaos and uncertainty, and that exhaustion is what's driving at least some of the resignation demands. Senators are essentially saying, we can't work with this president, we can't govern effectively with him in office. So the only solution is for him to leave. Whether Trump takes that message to heart or not, it reflects a deep breakdown in the relationship between the presidency and Congress that's going to make it incredibly difficult for Trump to accomplish anything for the rest of his term. Point three, will Trump actually resign? Almost certainly not. Trump's entire political brand is built on never backing down, never admitting defeat, always fighting no matter what. Resigning would be completely contrary to everything Trump stands for and everything his supporters love about him. They see him as a fighter who stands up to the establishment and refuses to be intimidated. If he resigned, especially in response to pressure from Senate leaders, his base would view it as surrender. as weakness, as betraying everything they supported him for. So politically, Trump probably can't resign even if part of him wanted to. And psychologically, Trump doesn't seem like the kind of person who would voluntarily give up power. He'd rather fight to the bitter end, even if he loses, than admit defeat by resigning. That said, the pressure on Trump is going to be enormous. When Senate leaders from your own party are publicly calling for you to resign, that's not something you can just ignore. It's going to dominate news coverage. It's going to be all anyone asks about in interviews and press conferences. It's going to make it harder to get anything done because everyone will be talking about whether you should resign instead of talking about your policy agenda. And it's going to eat away at whatever remaining political support Trump has. So even if Trump doesn't resign, the calls for resignation are going to damage his presidency significantly. He's going to be weakened, embattled, and increasingly isolated. And that's going to make the rest of his term incredibly difficult. Point 4, what are the alternatives if Trump doesn't resign? Well, there are basically 3 options. 1, Congress could impeach him again. We've talked about impeachment efforts already happening, and the Senate's loss of confidence in Trump makes impeachment more likely to succeed. If the Senate is already on record saying Trump should resign, it's not a huge leap to vote to remove him through impeachment if the House sends over articles. 2, the cabinet could invoke the 25th Amendment, declaring Trump unable to discharge the duties of the presidency. That's never been done before and would be incredibly controversial. But if Trump's dysfunction becomes severe enough, it's theoretically possible. 3, everyone could just limp along with a dysfunctional presidency for the remainder of Trump's term, with Congress trying to work around him and minimize the damage. That's probably the most likely scenario, but it's also deeply unsatisfying and potentially dangerous because it leaves the country without effective leadership. Point 5, what does this mean for American democracy and governance? Honestly, it's not good. We've reached a point where the Senate is publicly saying the president needs to resign. That reflects a level of dysfunction and crisis that's rare in American history. It suggests our political system is under enormous strain and may not be working the way it's supposed to. The constitutional design assumes a certain level of good faith and cooperation between branches. It assumes that the president will work with Congress, that Congress will perform its oversight role, and that both will prioritize the country's interests over partisan or personal interests. But what we're seeing now is a complete breakdown of that cooperation. The executive and legislative branches aren't working together, they're working against each other, and that makes it really hard to govern effectively. The long-term implications of this are concerning. If we normalize the idea that presidents can be so dysfunctional that their own party calls for resignation, what does that say about our system? If we can't remove a president through impeachment because it requires too high a bar in the Senate, but we also can't get them to resign voluntarily, and we can't use the 25th Amendment because it's too politically difficult, then what mechanisms do we have for dealing with a president who's failing? These are questions that previous generations haven't had to grapple with, but we're facing them now, and the answers are going to shape how American democracy functions going forward. There's also the question of how the American public reacts to all of this. Polling shows the country is deeply divided on Trump. His supporters see all of this as persecution, as the establishment trying to overturn the election and remove a president they never accepted. His opponents see it as long overdue accountability for someone who should never have been president in the first place. And there aren't many people in the middle anymore. So when Senate leaders call for Trump's resignation, half the country cheers and half the country sees it as a coup. That division makes it almost impossible to resolve the crisis in a way that brings the country together. Whatever happens, a huge chunk of the population is going to be angry and feel like the system has failed them. Look, I know this is heavy stuff. The idea that we're at a point where Senate leaders are publicly calling for the president to resign is almost surreal. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to read about in history books about other countries, not about America. But here we are. Capitol Hill is on fire, the Senate is demanding Trump's resignation, and we're in the middle of a constitutional and political crisis that we don't have a clear roadmap for resolving. Trump probably won't resign. Congress probably can't remove him through impeachment or the 25th Amendment. So we're likely looking at months more of dysfunction, chaos, and crisis as the government tries to function with a president who's lost the confidence of his own party's Senate leadership. What should you watch for? Pay attention to whether more Republicans join the calls for resignation. If it's just a few moderate senators, Trump can probably survive it. But if it spreads to more mainstream Republicans, if Senate Majority Leader or other party leaders join in, that's a game changer. Watch for whether the government shutdown gets resolved or whether it drags on, because ongoing dysfunction will only increase pressure on Trump. Watch for what Trump does in response. whether he tries to work with Congress or whether he doubles down on confrontation, and watch for polling and public opinion, because ultimately that's what drives political decisions. If Trump's approval ratings crater even among Republicans, that makes it politically safer for more Republicans to turn against him. We're in uncharted territory here. The Senate demanding the president's resignation is not something that happens in normal times. These are not normal times. And whatever happens next is going to be historic one way or another. Capitol Hill is on fire, and we're all watching to see if the whole thing burns down or if somehow we find a way to put out the flames.